Hello, everyone. This is Defense Politics Asia, and welcome to the super panel that I've arranged for the 1-year anniversary of the Ukraine war, or in Russia, the special military operation in Ukraine. So today we have prestigious guests that I managed to bring on. We have, should I introduce? Okay, Scott Ritter, Sanya Florida, and History Legends. I will let you guys to introduce yourself. So Scott first.
Well, hello, Scott Ritter, former Marine Corps officer, UN weapons inspector, and right now I'm doing a little bit of geopolitical analysis as regards to the Ukraine-Russian conflict.
And Sanya.
Hey guys, my name is Alex. I'm a YouTuber, blogger, economist, analytics, everything. Basically, I've been on YouTube for quite a bit. Unfortunately, my channel was deleted. Over 1 million subscribers, 300 million views, 1,200 videos gone without explanation of anything, just like it happens. So I had to move to other platforms, but I'm still pretty active, still actively covering the war, trying to just basically, share my opinion. That's all.
Sanya is also from America, so he's in Florida. On his name.
Yeah, the name.
and History Legends.
Yeah, so I'm History Legends. You can find me on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. My favorite topic is military history, and I try to apply all the knowledge I have in this topic onto the Ukraine war.
Yeah, cool. So usually I think let's start off with the first question. I would like this to be very fluid. We can just talk and discuss. But if we have nothing to talk, I will just ask some questions. I have some questions. So the most difficult question I think for most people who, especially those people who don't follow the war closely, is who is actually winning. What is the tide of the war now? It's very confusing because especially for people in Europe. Because they got so censored, their media is so censored that they actually have very weird understanding of the war from us, where we actually follow the war closely.
To know who's winning a war, you have to know what every country wants. And once we have established the winning conditions for both sides, then we can decide who's winning, right? So I think I'd like to hear what Sanya has to say. But this is the thing in the West I feel that nobody understands, is that first of all, there's no history of the conflict. Nobody understands the history of the conflict. People think it just happened out of nowhere. And the second thing, they don't understand the objectives of both sides.
Yeah, so about who's winning, I can tell you right now. I can tell you for sure that Ukraine is not winning. And I can tell you for sure that Russia is not winning either. Right now, it's basically a stalemate, which is the worst case scenario for both sides. Ideally, it would be great if one of the sides just proceeded further and ended the war, but that's not what's happening. I think who's winning right now is the United States, is the biggest supplier of the weapons. So it's great, awesome contracts, a lot of weapons flow. Ukraine puts in getting into debt deeper and deeper for generations to come. So the military-industrial complex is winning. The guys that supplying weapons are winning. So definitely not Russia, definitely not Ukraine. I think both of these countries are right now losing tremendous amounts of material, tremendous amounts of people. There is just grinder on the front. Bakhmut front is a grinder. It's a meat grinder. It's essentially right now Wagner Group is responsible for the whole for that part of the front, and it's mostly infantry attacks. They have echelon attacks based on the first echelon usually goes the prisoners who, so to speak in Russian, they trying to buy their freedom with their blood. So they are helping to determine where the actual defense points are, Ukrainian army, and then they're getting covered with artillery or whatever they have, and the second echelon goes, etc. So that's how the actual war is conducted. But in the end, it's just a lot right now. It's just infantry from both sides. It's not what we envisioned. I envisioned the war to be highly technological. How everything is technology, everything is equipment, something high tech, etc. No, that's not how it's conducted. It's
But
essentially
Sanya, you know,
a meat grinder.
even in Afghanistan, the war is infantry based. You know,
Yeah.
yes, there's technology, but you always need boots on the ground. And I think it's a myth that technology can replace that. But technology only can go as far, it can only help. So for sure, it was going to turn to this point, especially
So,
with big
Scott,
cities.
so Scott, who is winning?
Well, I mean, which war are we talking about? We're talking about the first war, phase one, where Russia was compelled. I mean, history legends talked about you have to know what the objectives are, you have to know what the background is. I think everybody should be clear here that Russia did not start this war. This war was started by NATO. This war was started by Ukraine. This is a war that's more than, I mean, people keep going back to 2014. I say, no, you got to go even further back. They go, what 2008, the invitation to NATO? No, go further back. You have to go to basically 1992, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the strategic decision undertaken by the collective West to keep Russia down through the expansion of NATO. That decision was made from the very beginning. So, you know, what was Russia's goal in initiating these, you know, preemptive collective act of self-defense, as they have correctly articulated under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter? The goal was to bring about a quick peace. That was the goal. There was already a war going on in the Donbass when Russia intervened. And Russia's goal was to achieve the peace that it tried to achieve nonviolently, one, by asking for Minsk to be accepted. All Ukraine had to do was accept Minsk, and this never would have happened, but they didn't. Russia tried, once they realized Minsk was closed out, they tried to get the United States and NATO to commit to a new European security framework articulated in 2 draft treaties submitted in December of 2021. The West ignored them. So Russia had no choice. The initial Russian action, I mean, myself, General Miley, William Burns, director of the CIA, everybody got it wrong. See, we thought Russia was going to war. We thought when Russia brought up 200,000 troops, they were going to war. Russia didn't go to war. Russia initiated a special military operation that was anything but war. It was soft. It was about troops moving quickly to create a presence. It was premised on what turned out to be fundamentally flawed intelligence that the Ukrainian army wouldn't resist, that certain civilian leaders who had committed to letting the Russian troops pass in would do so, because Russia had no intention of stealing Ukrainian land. What they wanted to do is get Ukrainian government to the negotiating table, which they did do. Starting in early March through March 6th, there were 3 negotiations that ended up with a final negotiation scheduled for April 1st in Istanbul, where a treaty would have been signed that brought an end to this conflict. I think people should understand a treaty was ready to be signed that would have brought an end to this conflict. That was Russia's goal. Russia wins, except NATO said no. Boris Johnson came in, pulled the plug. Now Russia moves into phase 2. Not unable to get the peace, Russia has to achieve through military means what it sought out to do, which is the protection of the Donbass, which it did by carrying out the beginnings of what we call the meat grinder operation in Bakhmut. Bakhmut fighting began in May. It's been going on ever since. They secured a land bridge connecting Crimea to the Donbass. They big battle of Mariupol. Victory, Russia. Phase 2, decisive Russian victory. They effectively destroyed the Ukrainian military. Problem is, phase 2 then transitions into new lend-lease, tens of billions of dollars worth of military equipment brought in. It's a game-changing moment. Not a game-ending moment, but a game-changing moment. Because now the Ukrainian military, which was fundamentally destroyed, reconstitutes using NATO equipment, NATO organization, NATO training, NATO communications, NATO intelligence, NATO operational planning. And they launch a counterattack, a very effective counterattack in September. Russia opts to give up land to save lives, and in the process grinds down the Ukrainian reserves. So what appeared to be a Ukrainian victory is actually a Pyrrhic victory, meaning they lost so many troops that their strategic reserves were eaten up. And so by the end of September, what we have is a Russian victory. You see, because Russia stopped the NATO offensive. And it was a NATO offensive. It wasn't a Ukrainian offensive. It was a NATO offensive. Russia inflicted 20 to 30,000 Ukrainian casualties, effectively eliminating their strategic reserves. Russian losses were in the hundreds, not strategic losses. They stabilized the lines. The Ukrainians thought that they were going to achieve a lot more than they did. They didn't. Now Russia moves on to the next phase, mobilization. Remember, as the Ukrainians have eaten up the reserves, Russia now is mobilizing 300,000 plus maybe 150, 200,000 more volunteers. This mobilization is completed right now. In the meantime, Russia engaged in the meat grinder operations in Bakhmut, continued offensive operations, continued defensive operations, destroying more Ukrainian reserves, again, at significantly less Russian losses. And that's where we're at today. We're at the place where Russia's defenses have solidified. Russia's undertaking limited offensive operations while they consolidate their reserves, bringing them in for a decisive commitment. Where are we going with this? I just use basic military math. The Ukrainians have been ground down to almost nothing. I mean, they had 700,000 troops. They're down to about 250,000. Okay, just think about that, the amount of losses that are required to, because remember, in the meantime, there were significant mobilizations that brought in tens of thousands of other troops. They're all dead. You say, how many dead? I don't know. Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, who is not prone to exaggeration, he's a pretty blunt, straight guy, has said he tagged and bagged 110,000 Ukrainians right in the Bakhmut area. That's dead Ukrainians. When I say tagged and bagged, I mean hands-on. These aren't theoretical dead. This isn't Vietnam War, drop artillery shells and then do a mathematical calculation. These are dead Ukrainians that Wagner has taken off the battlefield and processed, 110,000. Now, when you combine the rest of the areas, we're talking about 350,000 dead Ukrainians. We're talking another 350,000 wounded Ukrainians, probably another 100,000 missing Ukrainians. So Ukraine's eaten everything up. What has Russia lost? Probably around 45,000 dead, probably another 50,000 wounded, so about 95,000 total casualties. That's a lot, but it ain't 800,000. The other thing is that while Russia has suffered significant casualties, they're in the replenishment business. 300,000 reservists mobilized, ready for combat, 200,000 volunteers ready for combat. Ukraine, on the other hand, has nothing, literally nothing left. The reserves have been eaten up. They have maybe 40, 50,000 troops being trained in the West. These troops aren't going to arrive on time. They just, Ukraine just got a message from the United States. Forget what Joe Biden said yesterday. Forget it. The United States just put Ukraine on notice. There is no indefinite supply. This has to end. We're out. We have nothing left to give you. And this is on top of Jan Stoltenberg's admonition that there is no ammunition, that Ukraine will run out of artillery ammunition sometime this summer, and there's nothing left to give them. And I have to tell you, as a former artillery guy, when you run out of ammunition in the artillery business, you're going to die. So Russia wins. They're going to win. And they're going to win decisively, and this war is going to be over sometime this summer, early October.
And on top of what Scott Ritter, had to say, I think if we have to look at the map, because this is the victory condition for Ukraine. Ukraine wants to go back not to the 2014 borders, but to the 1991 borders. That includes Crimea. For Ukraine, this is a victory condition. So we have to simply look at a map. For now, a huge chunk of the 1991 border is still in Russian hands, including almost all of Luhansk, and Donetsk this is where the fighting is taking place now. So in this scenario where Russia, let's say, takes the Donbass, technically they could stop there. And this would be a win, a Pyrrhic win, because it would have been very complicated. But at this point, Ukraine has not reached the objectives that it has set itself. This is my opinion. So this is why there's this huge offensive prepared in the spring. Now they talk about an offensive against Crimea. It could also go against Luhansk, like they did in early September, October. But we know that for them, they have to go on the offensive, because if they keep on the defensive like this, for their political establishment, this is defeat.
Well, I think we need to point out. Go ahead, son. Go ahead.
Sorry. I was thinking. Sorry, Sanya. Sorry.
So we should also look at the economies. That's very important. I think today's wars are about economy. That's very important. So we know already, we have the numbers for full year of war, right? So the day after tomorrow will be exactly 1 year when this whole thing started. And just yesterday, Putin announced the numbers about Russia. He said, according to statistics, the Russian economy declined by 2.1% only. The estimates were minus, 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%. It depends who you asked. So essentially, it weathered the storm. There were a bunch of sanctions, but the Russian economy is still strong. Ukraine, on the other hand, minus 30% something, over 30% decline. It's going to come to a point where the West, collective West, is going to say, you know what, guys, we can no longer support. We can support the military, yes, maybe partially, limited support, but we cannot support the economy anymore, because if you continue falling like this, there's just no way for Ukraine to win in the long run. Always in the long attritional wars, Russia always prevails. So this is not for Ukraine to win ever. So a lot of things are going to be decided in the next offensive. I think both sides are gathering tremendous reserves behind the front lines. So it's really too early to say who's gonna win or who's gonna lose in even like a month from now. Everything can change. So I think we're at the crossroads where we cannot say 100% who's winning, who's losing, or who's going to win, who's going to lose. We know for a fact that Russia achieved a lot of goals that they wanted to. They established, just like Scott said, Crimea breach. They captured lots of territory, although it wasn't the goal in the beginning phases. They took lots of big portions of Lugansk Oblast, and of course, we have to look at the economies. That's the key, I think, going forward. The Russian economy just not going down, so therefore Russian people continue provide support. Because when the war started, I actually did a questionnaire for Russians, because my channel was on Russian. 65,000 people voted, and I asked simple questions. Do you support the special military operations? Yes or no? Do you support? And 75% said yes in the beginning. And later on, support, as far as I can tell, didn't weather. It didn't change. It didn't move a bit. So essentially, Russia can continue just like it used to for a very long time. I cannot say that about Ukraine, because they already conducted global mobilization, so mobilized everybody. It's like something like 16 to 60. So they're just running out of reserves right now. And Russia can do a second wave, third wave, etc.
And you know what's
still enjoy support.
Sanya, he brought up a good point, because while Russia thought that Ukraine would, let's say, collapse in the first few weeks, the West thought that the Russian economy would collapse in the first few weeks as well, because of all the sanctions. And both got it wrong. And so this is the crazy thing. Both were much stronger than people thought. But also, the one thing that I thought was interesting was when the media talked about how many Russians were leaving and everything. So I thought that was interesting. But what they failed to catch is that all the people that were leaving Russia were the people opposing Putin in the first place. So they went to the West, to Turkey, to wherever they could go. But if they're not in Russia, they cannot topple the government like the West had in mind. So the Russians, I think, in my opinion, the Russian government let them go. And by letting them go, well, you only have people that are more the 75% that Sanya is talking about, the ones that support the special military operation, like we said. But the West completely had it wrong. I don't understand how they could not see it, that those people, they don't have the same political ideology. And the fact that they're gone now, well, now Putin could do the mobilization without too much problem. All the videos that people showed about the mobilization, people complaining, they were not complaining about going to the front. They were complaining about not having the proper weapons to go to the front. That's a huge difference. That's a huge difference.
Which means it's the commitment, right? It's commitment that we're okay to go. Give us the right stuff.
And it's a normal, legitimate complaint. If you're gonna go fight, you want boots, you need body armor, you want ammo, you want guns, of course. But they didn't say, "Oh, we don't want to go." Oh yeah, blah blah blah. So this is once again, the Western media saw the thing, but the analysis of this event was completely wrong.
I'll point out on on the issue of people fleeing. I mean, first of all, I'll accept that there were some people who were sincere in their beliefs, in their anti-war beliefs. Almost everybody who fled were people that had no prior military experience, which means they were never going to get called up. The mobilization was for reservists only. So the people who ran, why did they run? To make a political statement. The majority of them were Navalny supporters, and this was a Navalny operation. I mean, I think we need to understand that these aren't people who woke up one morning and went, I'm fleeing. These are people who woke up and through social media were told, flee. And so they did flee. They thought they were going to make send a political signal. They thought they could trigger societal collapse. That was the goal. Regime change has always been the goal. A Moscow Maidan. It failed miserably. And these people now, I've just always said at some point in time, they're going to return to Russia. And they're going to be asked the question, hey, Granddad, what you do in the war? And Granddad ain't going to have the right answer because Granddad's a coward. But that's okay. That's something that they have to live with. But, 300,000 people weren't cowards. 300,000 people took the call. And these aren't hyper patriots. I think it's important to point that out. If they were hyper patriots, they would already be in the military or something. These are guys who want to be at home. They already served. They did their time. They're not lifers. They had jobs. They have grandchildren. They have children. They're trying to start a family. And then they get the mobilization call. You think they're happy about this? None of them are happy about it, but they did it because it's their duty. And I've always told people, I think, try and get into the mindset of the Russian reservists that are mobilized. You need to read Rick Atkinson's trilogy on the U.S. Army in Europe. History Legends, you should be familiar with that book, or the 3 books. Rick Atkinson, his trilogy on the U.S. Army.
I think it rings a bell.
All right, but the first volume deals with North Africa, basically a drafty army, learning the ropes. The second volume is Italy, Sicily, which is again much bloodier. And by the end of the second volume, basically what he's described is an army of draftees, not career military people, who didn't want to be there. They're not motivated by nationalism and let's all this. They're motivated by survival, but they've turned into an army of killers who realize the only way to get home is by finishing the job. Right now, there's 300,000 reservists who've been mobilized. They're in the SMO area, and they know the only way they're getting home is to finish the job. God help the Ukrainians in front of them, because these guys have something to fight for, and the Ukrainians don't.
But there's also, I hear my voice in the back, so somebody, I think there's the mics of somebody. But it's also interesting to speak about the beginning of the Russian offensive. A lot of Ukrainians actually went to defend their homeland as well. We can't forget that. Huge lines of people, I read reports, went to mobilization offices without being even called up. They went to volunteer, all right? Mm-hmm. However, this has changed since then. Now the situation for Ukraine, I see videos of people literally handing summons left and right. There's also a problem about desertion that nobody wants to talk about, but that the Ukraine commander-in-chief, Zaluzhny, also mentioned. He said, look, we do have a problem with that. So we don't know how many of that huge Ukrainian army actually just disappeared, vanished. We don't know. So this aspect also, and the casualties, we can't know for sure, because sometimes I feel casualties are counted double or triple. For example, there was this story of a guy who was captured by the Russians, released, sent back to the front, and sadly he got killed, a Ukrainian soldier. But that means you're counted twice as a casualty. And how many people are wounded and everything, it's very hard to know exactly. But now the problem for Ukraine, I think, is that they don't have enough manpower. Whereas, like Scott Ritter said, the Russians have a huge pool of manpower that are relatively willing to go to the front. So this is going to be very interesting.
So talking about going back to the first days, so there's a lot of debate, I think, even on the pro-Russian side, whether the Russians did things right or wrong. Especially when we all observe the fast advance, to Kiev and from Kherson, and then people think that Russia is winning, and after that, the whole thing just stopped. Mm-hmm. Then the people do not know and then after that, the retreat from Kiev. So what have Russia done right, and what does Russia done wrong? Since the beginning of war, over this 1 year. Any opinions about what, especially things that Russia have got it wrong?
Yeah, I can speak on that. So I think the plan was, I think it's pretty obvious right now, that the plan was something similar to Crimea. That was the plan going in. And because of that, me personally, I didn't believe that this is going to start. I knew, like, the American intelligence knew exactly the numbers of Russian troops that were on the ground next to the border. It was something like 200, 300,000. There was different numbers. Numbers were increasing, but it was still, I thought, well, this is not enough. If you go into a conventional war, for example, if you compare historically, like when some unnamed character tried to invade Poland, for example, he had 3 million troops on the ground, right? I'm just talking about purely from the troop perspective. I'm not comparing the two. Just purely from the troop perspective, I thought, well, maybe, I'm not sure what the plan is, but, you need at least maybe 1 million, maybe a couple of million, just to develop this initial success. So you have the initial success, what Russians had. That was done correctly. The troops that went in there were professional. They had exact plan. They were moving fast. They were breaking through everything. Nothing could stop them. They were just, capturing, going through huge territories, doing huge envelopments, and capturing lots of Ukrainian POWs. The battle for Mariupol, that's the only really battle for this war that was won. So it was done right, but the amount of troops, because they were counting on the of this war going according to Crimea scenario, where large portions of Ukrainian army are just going to say, well, we're not going to fight. We're just going to surrender. That's what happened in Ukraine, in Crimea, Ukrainian Crimea. When the Crimea operation started, the entire bases of Ukrainian army essentially put down their weapons and walked away. And there was actually videos online with them walking with a monitor out of there, dropped all their weapons. I think that was the plan, that, Ukrainian military is going to collapse and not going to fight. And that's why limited contingency was collected at the border, a couple of 100,000, let's say 250,000, and moved in. And that was probably a mistake, of course. I mean, we know it is a mistake right now. So that's probably definitely didn't go according to plan. That was not the plan to get sucked into a long conflict is going to last for years. I'm pretty sure that was not in Russian plans. The plan was to quickly surround Kiev, quickly capture and disable Ukrainian government, quickly capture Zelensky, or make sure he just flees out of Kiev, capture the capital, and see the entire military collapse after that. That was the plan. But we know now Russian troops got stopped near Kiev. They were not able to execute that plan, and we see what we see today.
I think it's very difficult, right? Because my assumption was the fighting will go from Donbass out. Like what happened in Georgia. I didn't expect them to open a direct front from the Russian-Ukraine border. So that was my own assumption, because when the troops marched in, I was thinking, see, why you don't follow why you don't believe what the Putin say. But I didn't expect them to go from the north and the south. But then I also didn't realize how militarized Ukraine was. With the number of foreign troops that was already inside, the mercenaries, the foreigners that signed up within the Ukraine army. That was a surprise to me as I was covering the war. I was like, how the hell which army do actually have so much foreigners, inside their regular military? It makes no sense at all. And which I believe is probably one of the reasons why it's not possible for the Ukraine military to just collapse on its own. Because all these mercenaries were like, oh, right, our moment is here. Then they went to stop the Russians at the front line. Especially, I think in Kiev I was quite surprised how they managed to stop the Russians from entering Kiev. Especially they all got stuck at the Irpin and Bucha region. That was also very interesting to me.
My understanding of the mercenaries, though, the initial batch, they actually were quite bad. Most of them are war tourists, guys who'd been out for some time, no recent combat experience. Some had no combat experience, therefore they were looking for combat experience, and that the Ukrainians were ill prepared to receive them. They received poor training, and when they went to the front, they performed so poorly the Ukrainians quickly withdrew them from the front. That there's a world of difference between this initial batch of foreign fighters and those who appeared on the ground in August and September. Those guys were actually professional PMCs, recruited specifically for special operations type background skills. They were organized into units that were designed to do a deep area penetration raids to exploit the gaps in the Russian defenses. And you know, those guys were qualitatively and quantitatively far superior than the initial batch. So I don't think we can speak of a homogeneous string of, you know, Western mercenaries. The first ones were LARPers. I mean, these are guys who just wanted to do some role play, and then they found out the hard way that it ain't airsoft. And the guys that went in later on are guys that are there to make serious money, because that's what professional mercenaries do. They make money, they deliver a product. But now the product doesn't work. See, they were brought in to exploit Russian defenses that had 60, 80 guys per kilometer. You know, had battalion, strong points with 5-kilometer gaps between them. You can't cover that with artillery. And so these guys, their job was to find the gap, exploit the gap, and then just go get in the rear and disrupt. And they did that. You won't find a 5-kilometer gap in the Russian lines today. You won't find any gap in the Russian lines. And if you do create a gap, you're going to go into a predetermined cauldron of fire where artillery is going to come down on you. And if you get through that, there's going to be a second line of defense that's fully manned, prepared to receive you. And if you get through that, there's a third line of defense. And as you approach the third line of defense, reserves that are already dedicated to the task will have responded. You see, the Russians are now organized doctrinally. They weren't organized doctrinally in phase one. Phase one was just a cluster, you know what, because they were expecting a even more rapid victory to compel the Ukrainians to negotiate. And by the time they moved into phase two and phase three, Putin hadn't mobilized because he couldn't. Politically speaking, he was still unsure. I mean, Sonia talks about, the poll was 75% support, but from Putin's perspective, there were two things. One, the economy. He himself admits that, even as in the summer and early fall of last year, he had no idea what the economy was going to do. That even though his people had made preparations, some of his advisors were saying, you're going to suffer 25% contraction in your economy. That has significant political consequences. People's appetite for war might not be as hungry if their economy is collapsing. So he was worried about that. Then the other thing is the mobilization. If you have a collapsing economy combined with an ill-timed mobilization, you might actually achieve what the enemy's looking to happen, a Moscow Maidan. So there was a lot of, hesitancy on the part of the Russians when it comes to, to the mobilization. But right now, those questions have been answered. Not only is the economy only contract 2%, it's going to grow next year. Think about that. Russia's under the most stringent economic sanctions in history, targeting Russian energy. And they're not only that, they're defense energy. Think about it. Anytime a nation goes on a war footing, defense-wise, it's borrowing. They go deeper into debt. Russia's defense industry is firing on all cylinders right now, unlike the West, by the way. And they ran a $38 billion surplus. The Russian economy is doing okay. It's probably the best wartime economy we've ever seen in modern history. The West, on the other hand, Europe's economy has taken a huge hit, and they're not even beginning to mobilize for war. When NATO said, "How can we get ammunition?" The Germans and the French are turning to their defense industry, saying, "Let's crank the production lines up." And they're saying, "Where's the money? We're private. We're not a state-owned entity. You want us to make ammunition? Give us the money." And they say, "Well, we'll do a short-term contract." You say, "We can't make money on a short-term contract. We need a long-term contract." But neither France or Germany wants to do long-term contracts because they don't think this war is going to last that long. So they don't want to commit to that. These are militaries and economies that have conditioned themselves for the past 30 years not to fight a large-scale ground combat in Europe. And that's the reality of NATO. General Cavoli, the commander of U.S. forces in NATO, all forces actually, spoke in Sweden last month. And he said the scope and scale of the violence that's taking place in Ukraine right now is beyond anything NATO ever imagined. NATO's not equipped, trained, prepared for that war. NATO can't fight that war. That's just an outright statement of fact. And the NATO economies aren't prepared either. They haven't produced the reserves necessary. Whatever reserves they had in terms of ammunition and supplies, they've given to the Ukrainians. And that's been lost on the battlefield. What, they're going to give 14 Challenger tanks? That ain't going to make any difference. 14 Leopard 2s? No. Oh, wait, Scott, what about the hundreds of Leopard 1s? They're never going to start because they've been in a warehouse for years, and the mice have gotten in there and eaten all the electronics, and now they have to go in and rewire everything, and that's going to take 6 months to a year. This is, the reality is NATO's not ready for this fight. NATO can't fight this fight.
And there's also one aspect that I find very interesting is that Ukraine has been at war since 2014, all right? But they lost significant military industries that were in the Donbass in the first few weeks of the war. But the question is, why hasn't Ukraine rebuilt their industry of their own? Because essentially, Ukraine wasn't building anything new. They were just revamping everything, and most of their stuff was coming from Russia up until recently. And people don't like to talk about it. But they have a lot of Soviet equipment, but they don't really have the capacity to build new stuff. This is why now they rely on all this NATO equipment. And there's this huge logistical war that, in a way, even Ukraine was not ready for it. They thought they would just fight some war in Donbass, like small-scale war like they were used to. And now, like you said, Scott, in the summer, the Ukrainian army had almost ceased to function. They had to rely on all these weapons and weapon deliveries from the West to survive. So I think the question is also, where did all the money of the arms industry go for Ukraine, for Ukraine itself? You know, they had thousands of tanks. Where has all this gone? I don't know. Why didn't they think of doing their own industry?
There's another big problem in Ukraine is corruption. If you've been hacked by somebody, I treat Ukrainian people with respect. This is not an attack on Ukrainians personally, but every time somebody tried to hack me, so somebody from Ukraine, right? So corruption, the level of corruption in Ukraine are legendary. It's probably undisputed. First 3 places probably in Ukraine, and facts of corruption are already known. So a lot of these weapons that are coming in, a lot of this money that's coming into Ukraine is going to somebody's pocket straight up. Some government official, some military. They already started killing each other for that. So it's this whole thing is going to be cluster of you-know-what, like Scott said.
Yeah, corruption's the when you're literally one of the most corrupt nations on the planet, and then you're given the gift of over $100 billion in aid with no accounting, no inspector general, no nothing. Just, hey, you guys are pretty corrupt. Here's $100 billion. Do the right thing. Don't be surprised that 70 billion of it has disappeared into pockets. It's crazy.
So the NATO is going to give a lot of IFVs, the Bradleys and also of IFV, the tanks. So assuming that they are able to bring it into Ukraine, because now they are trying their best to bring it to Ukraine. We do know that there's a lot of problems, like the Abrams tank. It sounds like a scam to make the Germans give up the Leopard, because the Abrams are not going to appear.
No Abrams yet, just the Leopards. They do Leopard 1 and Leopard 2. Leopard 1's like 45 millimeter armor. Hey, good luck with that. You're gonna need it. You're gonna need good luck with that tank on the battlefield. And Leopard 2 is a pretty good system, but they just don't have enough of it. They get what, maybe 50 if they're lucky. I mean, they were all promised like 350 or 400 or something. But right now, nations one by one just fall out of this. Oh, we can't we can't give you in the spring, maybe in the summer, maybe never. So they start to just pull out of all these promises. So one thing is promises, another thing is what's going to appear on the battlefield. Even if they get the entire several hundred Leopards, it's just not enough. And today's battlefield is just not enough to do anything significant because of the development of anti-armor means. So all the anti-armor weapons that the Russians have and even the Ukrainians have made these mass tank attacks no longer feasible. So even if they get tanks, yes, it's going to help them, but to what extent? It's just nobody knows.
So what's the best way to use this force? Let's say, assuming that all these force that they was promised was given, what is the best way for Ukraine to actually use this NATO-equipped new offensive force?
The same way they use tanks now. It's just a support vehicle for infantry attacks. It's just support. It's just like they use it as artillery tanks right now. They're just so few, and they're so vulnerable because in today's battlefield, a tank can be knocked out 3 kilometers away by some operator that the tank crew has no even chance of detecting. So it's not Iraq. It's not. It's completely different. The developments in anti-tank means are advanced to the point where large armor formations are no longer feasible at all. So I think it's just support roles. Yeah, mostly infantry goes forward, tanks somewhere sitting behind a few of them and just shooting the points where directed by the UAV, and that's it.
But the tank always had this role. Historically speaking, the tank always had this role.
Not always. No. In the World War II, the tanks were the backbone. You send forward a huge tank formation together with infantry after the artillery.
But that's a myth. That's a myth.
T-34 go.
No, but that's a myth. You needed air support, artillery support.
Yes, of course.
Already back then,
tanks were the deciding factor in the World War II. The tanks were your means of getting through, especially large tank formations, because to knock out a tank, that was pretty hard. There was no way to get an end-law or something. You needed to penetrate the frontal armor, and all you had maybe 76 millimeter weapon
guns
that might be able to if you see the tank is like 300 meters away or something, then you have a chance. But other than that,
I completely.
You have 50 tanks come out.
No.
It's actually it's an
no. I don't want to talk too much about it, but the anti-tank weapons like the 88 millimeter flak could destroy a Sherman at 2 kilometers away without even the Sherman knowing about it. So the Germans had excellent anti-tank weapons, and the Americans knew very fast that they couldn't send their tanks forward like that. They noticed it in Tunisia against the Afrika Corps that were elite fighters. The Americans suffered heavily, and then they rethought their strategy. So I wouldn't say that tanks now are... The thing now is just that there's more weapons now, but the tank has always had this supporting role in historically speaking. So the Arabs, the Syrians, when they tried to charge Israelis in the 1960s, 70s, it was the same result. Tanks formations had always this problem of lack of visibility, and infantry could destroy them. Now, the thing for Ukraine is that they don't produce the tanks. So they have losses. They can only repair that much, but they can't build new ones. So they need the West to replace the casualties. And this is the biggest problem. And the same thing you mentioned before, Sanya, about the C word about in Ukraine is that every loss for them is a huge loss. Whereas for Russia, since they build their own stuff, well, okay, if they lose a couple tanks, they can repair them. Worst case scenario, they build new ones. As long as the crew is alive, this is the most important thing. So this is why when you see footage of destroyed equipment, it's important to know, has the crew survived or not? The crew, if the tank got hit and the crew leaves, okay, they're going to jump in a new T-72, whatever, and they're going to go back to fight. So this is the real situation. It's a battle of attrition.
I would point out that the equipment is secondary to how the equipment's going to be used. And the biggest mistake the Ukrainians could make is to try and bring to fruition these plans of a grand spring offensive, because it's just not going to work. As I said, the Russians are organized in a density that is virtually impenetrable. They're organized in depth. This isn't September with the thinly spaced lines and no reserves. Russia is prepared. Russia loses this war if it turns into a war of attrition. I firmly believe that. I think that at some point in time, by the end of if this war is still going on by the end of this year, the defense industry potential of the West will begin to mobilize. And once the West is able to provide a continuous stream of equipment to Ukraine, Russia's in a world of hurt, because now Russia is going to have to, convert to a full-time wartime footing, and that could be a different ballgame. We don't know what that outcome will be. Right now, all the advantages accrue to Russia. So Ukraine's best choice, I believe, would be to use these reserves as a fire brigade, to defend where necessary, compel the Russians to commit to an offensive in a given area, and then at the moment of the Russian breakthrough, hit them with a counterattack, push them back, pull back, regroup. Don't expend your forces in a futile assault. Use your forces sparingly, commit decisively where necessary, and bleed the Russians down. But they're not going to do that, because politically, that's not what Ukraine's tasked to do. Ukraine has been told you need a decisive spring offensive in order for us, the West, to be able to justify to our population why we need to kick our defense industry into a wartime footing. The United States, as I just said, put Ukraine on notice. There is nothing left to give. We've got nothing left to give you. Keep in mind, people are going to go, wait a minute, the United States is big. We're getting ready to fight a war with China. So we have a lot of equipment that has to be earmarked to go to China. We have North Korea acting up. We have a lot of equipment that's earmarked for that. We have Middle East contingencies. So much of the United States military capacity cannot be committed to a conflict in Europe, in Ukraine. So there's a very limited amount of equipment, material, and support that we can provide, and we've pretty much tapped it out. NATO, as I said, is totally dysfunctional. The Germans had to cannibalize brigades to get a battalion sent to their Lithuanian deployment. There's nothing left to cannibalize. They're down to one battalion of Leopard A2s, or what, A5s, I guess, A7s. That's it. That's the modern one, A7s. They've got nothing. The French, they've got nothing. Who has anything? The British? You could put the entire British military into a soccer stadium and have 30,000 unsold seats. So, NATO literally has nothing to give. No equipment, no organization. Their air forces don't fly. Don't count all the German aircraft that appear on paper. 60% of them can't get off the ground because they haven't been maintained. They don't have pilots. If they do get off the ground, Europe has about 2 weeks worth of air-to-air missiles. Why? Because they've never planned for a large-scale combat where you're going to be in continuous air. When was the last time a European fighter shot anything down? When was the last time an American fighter shot anything down? We don't do air-to-air combat. So, pardon?
The balloon. They shot down the balloon. The Chinese.
Well, there you go. We've got some really good balloon guys.
F-22, they had a little balloon sign. They had the first kilo of F-22 ever. Yeah,
great. And I mean, our missile to target ratio is pretty good, right? Two $400,000 missiles to shoot down one $20,000 or $2,000 balloon. Take that price ratio every time. No, my point is the West is again. I defer to the commander of all NATO forces in Europe. NATO's not ready for this. They didn't envision it. They can't imagine it. They hadn't imagined it. No NATO country has been putting the resources necessary to prepare for this. They don't have reserves. They don't have ammunition stocks. They don't have fuel stocks. You can't fight a war unless you have the logistics in place. NATO was designed for short, quick duration operations. And this is a long, grinding out war. So I don't see this ending well for the Ukrainians for any number of reasons, corruption, etc. But I will say this, again, referring to Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, the Ukrainians ain't cowards. And I mean, you can disagree ideologically with the nationalist units. I do, vociferously. You can question the motivation of some of these troops. But when push comes to shove, these guys are fighting. And they're fighting hard. Prigozhin says so. He says these guys have steel cojones. So, let's keep in mind that this is a real war. This isn't a one-sided fight. This isn't Russia rolling over the Ukrainians. This is a bloody battle, street by street, house by house, block by block, tree line by tree line, trench by trench. And it's a war that I don't think anybody can imagine. Again, the United States lost. I was in Washington, D.C. last weekend, and I went to the World War II Memorial. And there's a wall with a gold star. And each star represents, I don't know, 2,000 dead or something like that. And the whole wall is full of stars. It's a little over 300,000 dead for both the European and Pacific campaigns. That's what Ukraine's lost in a year. And people need to chew on that number and understand just how bloody this fighting is.
How much more can Russia throw into the war? They have. It feels to me that they did whatever they can based on peacetime capabilities. But how much more can they throw? Like Ukraine was a surprise to me how much they able to pull out from their reserves. Like they have tanks that they never had. Like it's not supposed to be on paper. They managed to refurbish them. Fighter jets also. I thought the Air Force was gone. Suddenly the Air Force appeared again. So I believe the same will be on the Russian side. But how much more can Russia throw into this war?
Probably
everything. They're not going to lose. This is a war of existential survival for Russia. But keep in mind that Russia has mobilized to 1.5 million men. Russia's in the process of expanding their military. In addition to supporting the operations in the special military operation, concurrently, Russia is expanding its military to 1.5 million men, primarily contract soldiers. So
the big difference with the Russian army now compared to before, and I think I forgot to mention it, is that before, since they had this small political objective, the soldiers went in with 6-month contract. So it goes to show how they thought the war would go. But now, if you enter the Russian army, you stay in the Russian army. There's no more contracts, from what I understood. It's a bit like the U.S. soldiers during World War II. Once you enter the U.S. army, you don't leave the U.S. army until the war is over, unless you're dead. But so this is what happened, and this is why the U.S. army was a good fighting force, because you got wounded, you were sent to the rear, and then you were resent to the front once you were fine. So the U.S. army always had a huge pool of manpower. Now, the Russian army said, okay, we don't do 6-month contract. You sign in and you don't leave, even if you're a volunteer or whatever. So now the Russian army is just getting stronger and stronger. So this is one thing that we have to understand about their vision of the war. They think in years. Prigozhin in his interview said, yeah, it's going to last 1 more year before Donbass is conquered by the Russian army. 1 more year. And he said, oh, if we want to go to the Dnieper, that's 3 years. So it goes to show how far ahead they're planning. Now it's not in days anymore, it's years. So this is very important. And the way I see this war is sort of similar to the US Civil War between the North and the South. Because let's be honest, Ukraine and Russia are very similar in a way, okay? And they have similar ways of doing things. And just like the North and the South during the Civil War. Now, the North had more people and bigger industrial output than the South. And this is a similar situation that we see between Ukraine and Russia. And the South was also supported by the West at the time, by France, by Britain, and all this.
The East.
East. No, it's the East. But
West is Russia, yeah.
But so yeah, the Confederate forces at the time fought very well as well. It's just that they expended their resources that they could hardly replace, and it's a very similar situation that we're facing now in Ukraine. And the Union generals, let's be honest, a lot of them were not up to par with their role. They were not the best. Some of them were great, but a lot of them were just average. So yeah, we see the same thing in the Russian army. Some commanders are bad, and you have blunders. So yeah, the Union even had blunders up until the very end. Doesn't mean that it's a sign that it's a defeat, right? So this battle of attrition helps the biggest one, the bigger guy, who can afford these losses. Ukraine, it's very hard for them to replace losses. So we keep talking about material losses, but what about their population? how many men are available in Ukraine right now? How many have left? Apparently, they're even handing summons to Ukrainians now abroad. So this is a thing. How many men has Ukraine available? For real? This is the big question. So it's equipment, but also manpower. Can they replace the losses? So this battle of attrition is going to be very complicated.
It's interesting though, because Scott did mention that if NATO decided to really go into a war footing, like it's become really a NATO versus Russia thing, then the entire balance was tipped towards the West, right? Tipped towards Ukraine.
It would be like the Korean War, but I think the Americans want to keep that role of just sending equipment. They don't want to particularly fight against a nuclear power, because we never know how far it can go. But I think they just want to provide equipment and try to hold the balance like that.
Mm-hmm. So
yesterday, Britain announced the Russia's suspension of the attacking, so to speak, attacking weapons treaty with the United States. And he also said that they are going to prepare for nuclear tests but there was a stipulation if the United States conducts tests first. So kind of they exited the treaty, but there's also a stipulation. I would like to comment on the Air Force that Wyatt mentioned, that there is a destruction of the Air Force. They've been destructed several times over. Ukraine constantly getting weapons, the older Soviet weapons. This is the biggest issue for NATO, is because Ukraine has Soviet weapons, even starting from shell. It's usually 152 millimeter shells. So they can most of the Soviet weapons use this caliber. So they cannot use 155. If they use 155, they have to get something American, let's say M777 or something else. So this is a huge issue. Now they're running out of all these weapons they can give them. So MiG-29s, there's a lot of MiG-29s you see from other countries simply. They were not in Ukraine initially. So I think Ukrainian Air Force suffered a catastrophic defeat. It's been virtually wiped out. But they got a lot of systems from abroad, like from other countries, from Poland, for example. A bunch of MiGs came from other ex-Warsaw countries that still had the older Russian military jets in their armies. So now they're sending them over to Russia. Instead, they're getting American F-16s, and that's another way of profiting on this conflict, is selling all these countries the F-16s and making money. So that's the way it works. That's why you see these numbers of MiG-29s again. Well, how many MiG-29s you destroyed? A lot. No, because they came from all the countries around.
Mm-hmm. And what about the pilots? Are they all Ukrainian? Maybe.
Yeah, because you don't have to retrain. You have.
But the casualties.
Yes, casualties are high, but when the MiG is shut down, pilot has a chance to get out, right? So the pilot can survive sometimes. And also they have the schools, they have the instructors, they can train new pilots. They have actual huge ex-Soviet training facilities that are still on Ukrainian territory. One of them actually Russia tried to hit multiple times, but it still stands. So they can train pilots, essentially. They can train more pilots. They can, but the supply of these weapons is going to run out. It's a major problem for Ukrainian military. So they will need to switch over to these new types of weapons that they don't have any production facilities for. It's a huge logistical issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, can the West still continue to support Ukraine after year 2? Because this year I know the West or NATO can continue to support Ukraine, but after this year, after the next year, that means 2 years into the war, after the second year, can the West and NATO still continue to support Ukraine? What do you guys think?
They're already committed to it.
Yeah,
exactly. The president of the United States yesterday. So right after Putin's speech, he said, "Well, we're going to support Ukraine no matter how long. We just go." Until re-election, at least until re-election 2024. Then something might change. If Trump comes back, maybe he'll be, okay, guys, stop. Let's sit down, finish the war in one day.
Yeah.
But until then, 2024 for sure. 2023, 2024, until elections, end of the year.
They're going to be in here for a while. That means...
I don't know. A Biden administration official just told the Ukrainians that what Joe Biden said was a whole bunch of bunk. The United States has nothing left to give them. So no, we can't support into year 2 unless we mobilize our industries, and no democratic, based country is going to go through a wartime mobilization when they're not at war. Germany's not going to go on a wartime mobilization. France isn't going to go on a wartime mobilization. Both their economies are hurting. The United States isn't going to go on a wartime mobilization. And even if they did, how long does it take to do that? This isn't instantaneous. We don't have, dormant industrial production lines just waiting for the switch to be turned on. If you want to double production, you have to build from scratch a new production line. You have to train people, but first you have to get Congress to allocate the money. That's a fight. There's no guarantee. No, I don't think that this war is sustainable into a second year under the current conditions. There's nothing left to give them. There's literally nothing out there.
From an economic perspective, honestly, I don't know if the U.S. can continue. I don't have the numbers or anything. But let's talk from the moral points, like ideological points. In the West, they have told that the Russian army is fleeing. I remember reading articles from all over Europe in the West in September, October. The Russian army is fleeing. They're going to leave Ukraine. The Russian army is destroyed. They have so many casualties. Okay. But the people will see the truth eventually. They'll be like, how come we're still talking about it? Was there a lie? And I think this is also one thing of the entire equation is that, yeah, they give us these stories, but people will be like, okay, if the Russian army is really so bad, so destroyed, how come they're advancing right now? How come it's not over? They will have an explanation for this. They will need to explain. For me, that's the big thing. And the bubble might just burst at one point.
All right, gentlemen, on that note, I have to run, unfortunately. I'm on a short tether. And I have another obligation, but thank you very much, Wyatt, for the invitation. Sonia, it's a pleasure.
Thank you for joining.
History Legends, thank you very much. And
pleasure.
Let's do it again sometime.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, he's gone.
Oh, it's
actually, I have one more question. Only one last question, but he left. Actually, it's just a quick prediction of what will happen over the next 365 days.
No, this is the worst question because we always get it wrong. Like, honestly,
yeah. That's why it's supposed to be a quick one. It's not supposed.
This is a way to get roasted. When you say, something is gonna happen.
You said.
Something is gonna happen, and then nothing happens. You look like a fool.
I think Scott did kind of say it already. He said that he cannot see the West or America to able to sustain this support for this year. Just this second year, they don't. He kind of already predicted, the West cannot support this, which means that there will be a collapse. I think he also mentioned about how by summer, the Russians will start to roll over the Ukrainian military. So
we said that about the winter too. We also thought that every commentator was, Russian offensive in the winter is going to start now. And then you wait. It's going to start that day. No, actually, it's going to start when he does his speech. On the 24th of February for the anniversary. And then you always push and you wait. So,
yeah. That's what I tell my viewers. I say, they always ask me, when is the winter offensive? I said, now you're looking at the winter offensive. What are you talking about? This is the winter offensive. Now, how much more you want to expect, to happen?
But I do think that Bakhmut is the focal point of the war. This is why my YouTube channel is almost obsessed about the battle, because I just see the numbers of troops deployed there. We haven't seen such a huge battle like that since a long time. Like the intensity of a battle, I would say World War II almost in terms of intensity. So it's a very important battle. Ukraine has shown that they don't want to give it up, and because they made a commitment. So it reminds me of Stalingrad. But they have sent a lot of troops, and they still keep sending a lot of troops. Now they face Wagner alone. Apparently, Prigozhin said they're alone. Is it true? I don't know. Probably Sanya has more intel on everything what's going on this side, so I'll let you talk. But there's a lot of battles in the way before we can say what's going to happen. Like it's still volatile.
Sanya, any idea what happening between Wagner and the Russian military? I'm
Yeah,
so
there's
confused.
a conflict going on. So, and the conflict source is the competition between Ministry of Defense forces and the Wagner forces, because essentially they're part of the same pie. They get in pieces of the pie in terms of weapons and supplies, and of course they have to compete with each other. And now there's an open conflict that actually spilled into the battlefield. Prigozhin, according to Prigozhin himself, he said that his troops have been cut off from the shell supply. They're not getting, they're getting only 20% of what they are asking to continue conducting operations, because the shell expenditures are huge. This is how they conduct the war. They send the first echelon of troops to the battlefield. They determine where the Ukrainian defense is and just cover them with massive bombardment. And they need a lot of shells to continue. Now they've been cut off, and he's saying that the instigators of this cutoff are the top generals in the army. Essentially, it's the Shoigu with the Minister of Defense. Is the guy who's basically not signing the orders to supply the weapons to them, and he's saying that on paper the Wagner troops don't exist. They've been always supplied under a mysterious non-existent troops, because in Russian law the actual mercenary is outlawed still. It's not legal if you believe it or not, but still they have a huge private army that's conducting a war. So the conflict became, just the last 2 days, became very heated, with Prigozhin just recording the messages saying that I don't get no shells. We're out of shells. Our casualties are 5 times more. And he actually posted a picture of killed Wagner soldiers, the entire field. You can see it on his channel. This is all coming not from some Ukrainian little telegram. No, it's coming from his official Telegram channel. So he's saying there are huge problems, and I think that nobody can win Russia except for Russia itself. They start fighting with each other like this. If the conflict continues to grow and escalate between the Wagner and military defense, nothing good comes out of it. They're never going to capture Bakhmut. The offensive is going to stop and is going to stall and is going to roll back. So this whole war is so dynamic. It's impossible to predict what happens in a month, and we're not going to do that. But what I can guarantee you is going to be very interesting. It's going to be very, very interesting to watch it, because this is just changes so fast and so dynamic, and there's nothing in the world that attracts more interest, except for the Russian audience, for sure. I don't know, maybe in the United States this kind of conflict goes a little bit lower with time, but then it comes back up again and kind of goes low, because there's many news, like Ohio disaster comes on top, etc. But this is the thought. There's a huge conflict. It's not straight up. It's not a straight line. It's essentially a lot of moving parts, and it's impossible to predict, guys. It's impossible.
All right. So thank you everyone for participating, and of course thank you to Scott for joining, because he have to leave, because I only told him that it's going to be 1 hour. Then we kind of overshot it a little bit. So thank you everyone for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed the discussion. It's been 1 year now, so quite scary. I didn't expect me to cover the war for 365 days. So anyway, thank you for watching.
Days, guys.
And I'll see you in the next update.